Well, let's continue to look at how the Bible was built, and we'll look at the Old Testament part 2, the books that make up the walls and the roof of the Old Testament. In our last video, we looked at Deuteronomy as a cornerstone of our metaphorical house and the law as a foundation for the Old Testament of the house of the Bible. Now we turn to the books of the Old Testament that make up the walls and the roof. And for that story, we turn to the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a group of people who lived in Samaria, an area north of Jerusalem. They were mixed with Gentiles as well with non-Jews. When Assyria captured the northern kingdom of Israel in 721 BC, some were taken in captivity while others were left behind. The ones who were left behind intermarried with the Assyrians. Thus, these people were neither fully Hebrew nor fully Gentiles. This sect only recognized the Torah, the Pentateuch, as scripture because at this point in Jewish history, the 5 books of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew scriptures, of the Tanakh, were the only books accepted as scripture. At this time, Jesus and the Jews, at the time of Jesus, the Jews and the Samaritans did not deal with one another. Jesus, however, ministered to people of Samaria, preaching the good news to them. From the Samaritans, we turn our attention to the Sadducees. The Sadducees were another Jewish group, also recognized the Torah, the Pentateuch, the Tanakh as Holy Scripture. The Sadducees were the royal priests of the religion of Israel. They were the keepers and officials of the temple in Jerusalem. There weren't very many of them, but because of their high position in Jewish life, they were very influential. The vast majority of the Jewish people, however, came to look on the law of the foundation of their scripture. We can think of the rest of the Old Testament as the roof and the walls constructed on this foundation. From Samaritans, Sadducees, we turn our attention to the Pharisees. The Pharisees flourished in Palestine during the latter part of the Second Temple of Israel, which was around the period of 515 BC to 70 AD. The Pharisees emerged as a party of laymen and scribes and contrasted the Sadducees. So the Sadducees, a party of the high priests that had traditionally provided the sole leadership of the Jewish people. The basic difference that led to the split between the Pharisees and Sadducees lay in their respective attitudes toward the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. The Pharisees believed the law that God gave to Moses was twofold, consisting of the written law and the teachings of the prophets. The priestly Sadducees taught that the written Torah was the only source of revelation. So in Acts chapter 23, verses 6 to 8, here's what we read from Scripture. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, "My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descendant from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of my hope of the resurrection of the dead." When he said this, a dispute broke out among the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but Pharisees believed all of these things. So let's look at the prophets and writings of the Old Testament. The prophets, these are the walls of the house. We can consider the prophets as the walls of the Old Testament. The letter of Amos was the first among a group of writers whose books comprise the section of the Bible we call the prophets. Amos did his writing in the 8th century, probably around 750 BC. Hosea, Micah, and Isaiah also wrote around the same time. They were contemporaries. So here are some of the themes of these writings. Amos said, God expects his believers and everyone in every nation to live right lives and to show mercy. This marked a great step forward in religious thought. We call Amos' idea of God ethical monotheism, meaning he believed that there was only one God who demands certain kinds of behavior from all people. The prophet poet Hosea wrote in his book, not long after Amos, Hosea stressed the redemptive love of God. Isaiah was also written around the time of Amos and Hosea. In Hosea's book, we read beautiful descriptions of the ideal king who will bring in one day a new age of justice and righteousness. In chapters 40 to 55 of the book of Isaiah, Isaiah communicates how God shapes human history. Also in these chapters, we find the sublime poetry about what scholars call the suffering servant, which was a prophecy of the coming Messiah, Jesus, years later. So, on the foundation, we have the law or the Torah or the Pentateuch. The laws were erected, then the walls were erected of the house of the Bible, and we call them the prophets. From the major prophets now, we turn to minor prophets. They're called minor prophets just because they were smaller in size, not because they were of lesser importance in the books. In fact, the Jews thought of these collections of minor prophets, of these writings, as one book. So oftentimes the Jews, you'll read that all of these minor writings will be in one book. So the foundation of our house, we always go back to this, was in the 7th century BC. When the book of Deuteronomy was discovered, it took approximately 200 years for the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers to be accepted as scripture by the Jews. And you could write this down for notes. And even though they had been reading the letters of the prophets for a long time, recognizing the religious value, it took nearly 200 more years before the Jews thought of the prophets as scripture. So sometime around 200 BC, the Jews accepted what we call the books of history and the prophets as scripture, and they should be included along with the Torah. So in the period of roughly 400 years, the Jews put in the foundation of the Old Testament, and therefore the foundation of the Bible and its walls were in place. So returning to our metaphor, our metaphorical house, we need a roof. We have a foundation, we have walls, now we need a roof. And the writings of the roof of the Old Testament make up the roof. One of the pieces of the writing in Jewish history are the Psalms. The Psalms were very important to religious life of the Jews. They were the hymns as well as the prayers. We suppose they were used in public worship as well as aids to their private devotions. The Psalms are a different type of literature, a different type of genre. There's a collection of writings that do not fit into the law nor the prophets. This group of writings is a mixed bag that we call writings. So for example, Job is considered in the writings. Job is a philosophical essay. Song of Songs is a poem about love. Lamentations as well. A lamentation. It expresses grief. And then 1st and 2nd Chronicles is a history of Jerusalem. And then Daniel is a story about young heroes of the Jewish faith. This section of the Old Testament also includes the books of Proverbs and Ecclesiastes, which includes various teachings about the life and the human conditions and the stories of Ruth, Esther, Ezra, and Nehemiah. The Jews referred to this diverse group as writings. So much more could be said about this. In the next video, we'll look at how the Apocrypha came to be, what it is, and should we consider the Apocrypha to be inspired? As always, there's been a lot of resources that have gone into this series. Resources like the book How the Bible Was Built, or F.F. Bruce's The Canon of Scripture. And if you like this, be sure to continue to watch for more as we move and look into the Apocrypha.